I'm now far more worried about what is at stake. I genuinely think if we do not fix this now, we are going to be in a terrible, terrible place over the next 10 years.
Liam Byrne is the Labour MP for Birmingham, Hodge Hill and Solihull North. He's written a book called The Inequality of Wealth.
So a 1% tax on the assets of those who own more than 10 million. And let's not forget why the top have done so well in the last 10 to 15 years. If we are going to fix this country, and it is broken, it's not free.
I love the book. I had a good listen to it yesterday.
Great, thank you.
Has Keir Starmer read it?
I don't know. He's certainly got a copy.
Has he got a copy? Not a signed copy like mine.
Well, actually, it is signed.
Oh. Is it to Keir?
It is definitely to Keir.
Do you you don't know if he's read it. Do you think that him and the Labour Party are aware of the inequality problem?
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you think about the journey that most of the new government have been on, a lot of them were elected in about 2010. They've gone through the really tough years of what I call the ABC of British politics: austerity, Brexit, and then chaos of Live Trust. And a lot of them kind of cut their teeth in the kind of social organisation that members of the Labour Party tend to get involved in, organising food banks, organising charity drives, taking benefit awareness campaigns, that kind of thing. A lot of us, in a way, are social workers because we believe in society. And if you believe in society and you get involved in the kind of politics that we believe in, you're ultimately a social worker. It's something that Clement Attlee actually wrote a book about after the First World War. And so I think if you look at the programme that has been set out in the King's Speech, there's a few components that speak to some of the ideas in the book. There's a lot that wasn't in the King's Speech that I think the government needs to kind of pursue. But they've got a reasonable platform now, and the key is now obviously a budget that makes a difference.
Why do you think the manifesto was so light on tackling? It didn't read like a tackling inequality manifesto.
I think, when you're writing manifestos, if you look at the big change manifestos since World War II, so 1945, 1964, 1979, 1997, most of those manifestos were quite short documents. And what they tended to do is to offer an argument to the British people to say, look, we are in a right mess. We are going in the wrong direction, and a change of direction is now needed. And that was very much the story of the Labour manifesto this time round. Now we've got power. It's up for people like me to kind of say, well, look, with that power, we need to transform our country and make it a more equal place. And if we don't, we're in serious difficulty. And that's why the book was written when it was. That's why it came out in January this year. And that's why we're launching the paperback now.
How bad is the wealth inequality problem? Because, I mean, there was a statistic I saw, only 8% of the wealth is held by people aged 20 to 40 in the country, which is...
Well, young people, you're right. Young
which
people,
is wild. Which is wild.
Young people are absolutely at the sharp end. So look, so the good news is it's not as bad as the days of Downton Abbey. It's not as bad as it was in the 1920s and 1930s, but something really profound happened in 2010. So in 2010, things began to change quite radically. Since 2010, the top 1% have multiplied their wealth by 31 times more than everybody else. And the people who are at the sharp end of that inequality are young people who can't afford a house, can't afford an education, can't afford to repay their student debt, can certainly not afford to repay their pension. And what we saw in the election results is something quite interesting. What we saw is that a big part of that anger that went into the reform vote was in those places where deprivation is worst. So if we're serious about defeating populism, we have to fix wealth inequality, and we have to start creating a different kind of future for our young people.
One thing that surprised me, maybe, I think people of our generation can often say that the people of the generation above us had it all great, but you showed within your research that anyone born after about 1964, so there isn't a boomer, there's just been a decline in prosperity of essentially everyone that come after that point.
Yeah, so there's two things going on here. So one, those who kind of started work, after the 1970s, certainly after the 1980s, they're competing in a global labour market which is 1 billion people big, because after China joined the World Trade Organization and this huge migration from the farm to the factory in China added hundreds of millions of people to the labour market. Couple that with capital mobility, you've now got a global market in which we're all competing as workers. That has kept a cap on wages. And if you add into that some of the laws which haven't encouraged trade unions, you get a real problem on the wage front. But second, it's just become really difficult for young people to buy assets, whether that's a pension, an education, or a pension, And part of the reason for that is assets are now much more expensive compared to wages. So when I was born back in 1970, the wealth of the country was about 3 times the annual wages of the country. Now the wealth of the country, and therefore the asset prices, are 10 times the average wages of the country. So what that means is assets are just now far, far more expensive compared to the wages that anyone can earn.
And important.
And important.
In terms of life outcomes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Inheritance
happiness,
and things. And
feeling of security, your freedom, your agency, your options, your opportunity. You know, there's a big old debate about freedom in politics, but the truth is that there isn't any freedom worth its name without security, and there's no security without wealth.
Do you think someone can come from a working class or whatever that means, or a lower income background and prosper in this country now?
So I do. And the book before this was a book called Dragons, which was an economic history of Britain told through the lives of 10 of our greatest entrepreneurs. And, you know, that does tell you that it is possible that, you know, the rags to riches story is possible. But the truth is it's unusual. You know, most of our most successful entrepreneurs don't come from the most humble working class routes. They come from middle class routes. They've had the resilience to fail and fail and fail and then succeed. You know, so I was lucky. I went to a pretty violent comprehensive school in Harlow, but thanks to a Fulbright scholarship, I went to the Harvard Business School. I was the only kid from a British comprehensive school there. And when I was raising money for my business at the end of the dot-com boom, I couldn't get money from American venture capitalists because they said, look, unless you failed 3 times, we don't think you've learned enough to invest in. But who can afford to fail 3 times, you know? Well, actually, middle-class kids can. Working class kids, it's a hell of a lot tougher. It's not impossible, but it's a hell of a lot tougher.
Yeah, I've seen a criticism of this recently online, this fail culture where people are like, you need to fail all the time. And, you know, if you're from a background where you've got nothing to fall back on, you might borrow the only bit of money you can off your mum. You can't go back to and go, oh, that one didn't work, but, you know, the next 10 to one.
It's quite a short conversation.
Yeah. So I would like to ask there was a quote in the book. Can I just read it?
Yeah.
That I think... like I said, I did really enjoy the book. I liked how you started by looking at extreme wealth and you used your experiences of going to like Rolls Royce and things like this.
Yeah, that was wild. You should go and see how a super yacht's built. That really is mind-blowing.
You described it as I don't want a car. I want a car that's sort of a Ferrari, sort of a Lamborghini. And that's what private yachts are, right? A million man-hours into a boat. It's a kind of unimaginable levels of wealth that you could fully customize a boat, right? Most people aren't exposed to that. But you said that corruption begins when wealth seeks power to protect fortune.
Yeah.
I think most normal people, I don't know how to describe them, but 99% of the UK population feel that there is that kind of corruption. Do you feel as someone that's part of a Labour Party that exists?
I do, and I feel it more now than I ever have at any point in the last 20 years. So, you know, I've been in and around politics for 35 years. That is amazing. Thank you. I've been around politics for 35 years. I've been an MP for 20 years. I've never seen the kind of money that we now have washing around Westminster. And it's insidious, and it's also not quite, it doesn't quite present in the way you would expect. So it's not people turning up to the House of Commons with checkbooks, you know, stepping out of a Rolls Royce and writing politicians a check. It's kind of much more subtler than that. It's people pumping millions into TV stations or think tanks that don't disclose their funding. It's people who organise leadership campaigns, who put money into leadership campaigns, who crucially make sure that their preferred candidate wins a particular election. So it's much more subtle. It's fought at the battle, in a battle of ideas. It's fought at the battle of candidates. And that's not quite obvious to the British public. But the amount of money that is going into British politics now is mind-blowing. I added it up. It's about £1 billion. Over £1 billion has now gone into British political parties since we started a register. And a really surprising amount of that comes from a very, very small number of individuals. And I worry about that.
Do you see it as almost like an Americanization of politics, where they rely on these massive donors, and campaigns cost $1 billion, don't they, just to go on tour?
Yeah, 100%. And I talked to Bernie Sanders about this. The Bernie Sanders interview was quite an interesting one. I mean, Bernie is to the left of me, but he's really interesting about the impact of big money on American politics. And he was the one who said to me, look, if you think about this, let's say you're a chip manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company, you're trying to lobby for rules, and you might spend, you know, tens of millions of pounds on trying to influence those rules. But if you get the rules you want, those are billions and billions in economic returns that you're going to get. So in the scheme of things, the amount of money that you invest in lobbying is actually quite small compared to the prizes that are on offer if you get public policy in a place you'd rather like.
And what do you think the solution is to that, to give a voice to people that don't have that kind of economic return of, someone on a council estate up north?
Yeah.
There isn't that payoff of like, well, if I throw £100 at this, I might earn 1,000.
Or indeed in Hodge Hill and Solihull North. No, so I think one, you've got to expose it. Two, I think you need much tougher limits on who is allowed to give. Once upon a time, I was not in favour of state funding of political parties. I think I kind of am now. The Germans have had this quite successfully for a while. If you really want to insulate your politics from the impact of big money, then that might be a step that we have to consider. And, there are some really mad loopholes that we've got. So there is we're not under parliamentary privilege on this podcast, so I'll be careful in my language. But, there is an individual who is deeply involved in one of our political parties, who is deeply connected and has family connections back into Russia. And where we saw, and this is a New York Times story, where we saw money moving out of an individual's bank account in Russia into the bank account of a UK citizen, and then into the coffers of one of our main political parties. And right now, that's perfectly legal. It's morally wrong, but it's currently legal. So there are kind of, mad loopholes like that we should be trying to fix as soon as we can, really.
What parties do you think are benefiting most from this flow of money?
So look, in the past, it's been the Conservative Party and Reform. But if you look at the amount of private donations that's come into the Labour Party, you can basically see that money follows power. And do you know what? That has been true since the Roman Republic. You go back to the works of Cicero and Sallust, they warn about the risks of big oligarchs in politics as a destructive force. And this is just an eternal truth in our politics. And it's, I'm afraid, more true today in British politics than I think I have ever seen in the last 20 years.
Well, is democracy not that every vote is worth the same amount? In a system whereby people can buy influence, then that destroys democracy, right?
100%. And it's just, I think, it took me a while to map this and understand it, because it's not just donations to political parties that you should worry about. In today's media landscape, you've got to worry about people pumping millions into loss-making TV stations. Some of those TV stations route significant amounts of money to particular politicians to pay them to be presenters. But equally, at the level of ideas, most think tanks don't declare where their money comes from. And yet you think about a think tank that might be drawing its money from a particular kind of individual. It then produces a grand report with lots of graphs and analysis and infographics. That's then a talking point on the BBC, gets picked up by the newspapers. It's part of the influence operations. And so I think, we have to look far more at who is paying for influence in our politics beyond simply looking at who is making, who is writing a check for a particular constituency party.
It's more subtle than they made a donation, because I think a lot of it is like, this person made a £500,000 donation to the Conservative Party. What you're saying,
that's the tip of the iceberg.
It's this like guiding hand of influence.
Exactly. That money that goes to a political party is the tip of the iceberg, and actually what people need to pay far more attention to is the iceberg underneath the water.
There's a problem that a lot of business owners face. I was one of them until recently. What do you do with the money that's sitting in your company? That excess money that you don't need to use to operate, but you don't want to rip it all out and just get taxed into oblivion. If it just sits there, inflation destroys the real value of it. But a lot of small companies, including sole traders, don't do anything with the cash in their business accounts. This is why I'm happy that we're partnering with Tide. They offer an instant access savers account where new customers get 4.33% AER variable on unlimited deposits until at least March 31st, 2025. I use a Tide account, and I even store the money that I need for my VAT in there just to generate a bit of interest while I'm waiting to pay the bill. If you're interested in putting your money in the business to work, head to tide.co/savings. There's a link in the description for you. For full offer T's and C's and Tide's terms, visit tide.co/terms. The variable rate is correct as of the 1st of October 2024. You look at the City of London as one big cesspit of dirty money in a sense.
Yeah.
That's the impression you gave of it as well. And then this interaction with politics and London. And it's not just politics, is it? It's the finance world facilitates
Yeah, I mean, I was traveling actually through the Caucasus this summer, and I was talking to Russians some of who were fleeing the draft in Russia, but others were basically relocating from businesses in Russia. You know, they'd headquartered in Dubai, they were running their operations out of Armenia. And, you know, they talk very openly about how London is such an attractive place to kind of come and live, to come and work, to come and invest in property, to send your kids to school, to get involved in greenwashing your reputation by investing in, I don't know, a charity or a university college, getting involved in political fundraising, that kind of thing. So, you know, there really is a bit of a playbook now for how people launder dirty fortunes, and involvement in politics, I'm afraid, is one of the tricks of the game.
Or football. Premier League.
Or indeed football.
Yeah,
football's got some really big questions to confront.
So we're going to get on to solutions in a second, but I do just want to talk more about the problem, because I think people know inequality is bad, but I think to hear it from someone like yourself, this is what they want to hear. And I don't know why, personally, the Labour Party haven't been more forthcoming about this point, because we've seen the rise of populism.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned it there. It seems easy to me for Labour to come out and say, we think this is an issue and we're going to solve it, and they would win a load of votes. Why did they not do that?
Well, you're preaching to the converted. I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's why I'm in politics. That's why I'm staying in politics. That's why I'm still a member of the Labour Party. That's why I'm on the back bench, not the front bench. It's why, you know, I was lucky enough to win an election to chair a select committee, because I want to use that platform in Parliament to campaign on this topic. Because if we don't act now, this is about to get much worse. So if we don't act today, we will see the wealth of the top 1% just boom further. And that has real risks for our politics. The corruption that we begin to see today could get 10 times worse over the next few years. So, you know, in a way, we're kind of at a bit of a tipping point. And, you know, some of the work that I'm publishing soon around the rise of populism in the last general election clearly shows that there is a relationship with wealth inequality and deprivation. The Reform vote, for example, is much bigger in constituencies that are poorer. For every 10-point fall in deprivation, there's a 10-point fall in the vote for reform. That is telling us something. It's telling us that people are angry, trying to send a message, and the message they're trying to send is, we're sick of being left behind. We want to live in a fairer, more equal society.
Do you think Brexit was a similar vote?
100%. You know, I mean, my constituency voted just slightly for Brexit. And all of the conversations I had with people on the doorstep basically came back to, we do not think the system today is working. We need to blow it up and do something radically different. And in a way, Brexit was a kind of a cry for help as much as anything else.
Are you from Birmingham originally? Or
No, the holy town of Warrington, just outside, 13 miles from Anfield.
What makes it holy?
What makes it holy? I was born there under the, not quite in a manger, in Warrington General Hospital. But I have 5 generations of family in Birmingham back to 1803.
Yeah, because you mentioned Birmingham. I'm originally from Aston in Birmingham, but I live in Southport now, which is the holy town of Southport.
Yeah,
the very holy town.
Yeah.
God's country.
But you must recognise this then amongst kids you grew up with.
I'm massively passionate around, I mean, like, what I've essentially seen is the North be ignored, you know, time and time again. Devolution and just knowing that great people live in where I'm from, and then seeing their hands tied behind their back. We give a lot of that conversation on here, because I do think that, you know, we look for growth and we look for productivity, but you've got 90% of the UK population that aren't even at the same level as the people in London, because they don't have the same tools. I have bad internet. I don't even have broad, like, fibre internet in my house, and I run a media company.
The transport aspect is crap.
Try getting to
hard to get
London.
around.
I can fly to Paris or whatever quicker than I can get to London from Manchester.
And when you look at the wealth stats, the wealth stats show almost no progress in the wealth of different regions. So almost all of the wealth that has been created in the last few years, I think it's about 70, 80% of the wealth that's been created since about 2010, has been in London and the Southeast. Now, that's telling us something. I mean, are people in the North less hungry for success than they are in London?
The Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. Yeah. So what is missing there? All sorts of things are missing. And that's why one of the big arguments in the book is we've got to radically devolve power and resource out of Westminster and Whitehall.
Is there an appetite for that within central government, within organisations that control that power at the minute? Whitehall, you know, these we've had criticism of these bodies where people have said there's basically 100 people there that are masters of the universe.
Yeah.
They don't want to give that up.
Well, The words are in the right place. So Labour's committed to a big devolution bill that in theory should get power and resource out of Westminster and Whitehall. But I tried to do this in 2009 when I was in the Cabinet Office and was defeated by an unholy alliance of civil servants who wanted to keep that power and resource in the centre. And you hear prime ministers and former prime ministers say, wow, one of the big frustrations is, you can't grip the levers of power. And that sort of betrays an attitude, which is we've got to try and hoard all the power and resource in Westminster and Whitehall because the people at the top, they know best. And I don't believe that. I think the people at the bottom know best.
Yeah.
I mean, what makes this different now, though? Because the rich have always got richer, the wealthy have always got wealthier, and London's always been making decisions for the rest of the country. So what makes you think now this Labour government or anything will be different now going forward?
Because I do think that was the mandate that we were elected on. So when Keir Starmer launched Labour's manifesto, it was about a wealth creation boom. We wanted to create a revolution in wealth creation, not for those at the top, but for all. So in a way, the pledge is in the right place, and it's now down to people like me and the public to help make sure that Labour's held to account for that and delivers on that. But second, I come back to this point that if we don't sort this now, we are heading for really difficult times. Populism is already bad. Populism melts the joints that hold nations together. Populists aren't good leaders. Look at, what Donald Trump has done. They destroy institutions. And the opposite of populism is separatism. Because if you've got populists in power in the capital, there will be all parts of the country who just look at it and think, we're not having that, thanks very much. Yeah. We're heading our own way. And you can see this all over Europe. And that's what I think you would see in Britain. So I do genuinely think the integrity of the United Kingdom is at stake here. If we don't fix this, we will get a politics that is so febrile, so difficult, so angry that the UK will start to fracture.
Can we outline what we mean by the rich? Because one thing that I think politics has done a pretty bad job of is pitting people on 20 grand against people on 125 grand.
Yeah.
These are the rich. Whereas actually, you're talking about the 1%. Is it more than 0.1%?
I think it is. So some of this debate comes into view on the debate on wealth taxes. So there's a group that I kind of hang out with every so often called Patriotic Millionaires, who a group.
What a party that'll be!
I know.
Happy about being millionaires.
They had quite an interesting reception last week. But this is a group of people, right, who have all done really well, and who believe that patriots pay their taxes. They believe that wealthy people should be paying more tax, and they're coming together to say, look, if you put taxes up, you're not going to have a flood of millionaires leaving the country, as some newspapers would have you believe. It's actually the right thing to do. And one of the ideas that is knocking around is this notion of a wealth tax, so a 1% tax on the assets of those who own more than 10 million. That's 22,000 people. That's not a lot.
That's not a lot
of people.
You couldn't even fill a football ground with that.
You could not even
that Premier League ground.
Not even in Birmingham.
Definitely not a Man City.
But that would raise you billions of pounds if you did that. And the argument I say in the book is, look, rather than just put the proceeds of wealth taxes into general government spending, let's put it into something that looks and feels a little bit like the National Trust, because people are genuinely worried that governments waste money. We've got to recognise that is a fear that people have. But if you put the proceeds of those kind of wealth taxes into something like the National Trust or like a sovereign wealth fund, you would quite quickly be able to build up a fund of about 200 billion. That would take you about 4 or 5 years. And 200 billion is the kind of magic number in a way for me, because that would allow you to pay a dividend, a one-off dividend every year of £10,000 to every 25-year-old in the country. £10,000 is the average shortfall on a deposit to buy a house. So maybe this is the wrong idea, but it's a provocation. And if it's the wrong idea, my challenge to people is, okay, fine. You tell me a better idea for how we're going to help young people get a foot on the housing ladder. Because I know that we've got to build more houses, but you can't fix this problem simply by building more houses, because people will buy them up and house prices will still continue to rise. You've got to actually fix people's lack of money to put down a deposit to buy a house. You've got to have longer mortgages and lower fixed-term interest rates. All of that's true. But you've got to fix the deposit problem. Bank of England says the lack of a deposit is the biggest barrier to young people getting on the housing ladder. And there is a choice for us. We could say to people who have done super well over the last 10 to 15 years to pay a little bit more tax, perhaps as a one-off on their fortunes, and use that money to help young people get a stake in society. And let's not forget why the top have done so well in the last 10 to 15 years. We've put £1 trillion of quantitative easing into the monetary system. That's held interest rates down by, on average, about 1%. If you were lucky enough to own assets during that time, you've seen your fortunes boom.
You call it alchemy, the closest thing to alchemy
It's the
that we have.
closest thing to alchemy.
Yeah.
And so let's call it a windfall tax. It's £1 trillion of money backed by British taxpayers. But the prizes from that investment has gone to a very narrow section of society, in particular the 22,000 people with the biggest fortunes.
I always thought it'd be great to outsource all of the time-consuming admin in your personal life, from laundry to booking flights or whatever, things that just need doing. Of course, the same thing goes for running a business. And one of the most important bits of admin that you do as a business is compliance. I'm talking about stuff like showing you're compliant with GDPR, SOC 2 and ISO 27001, so you can just land more deals. Proving compliance with these standards isn't why you're building your business, but they are necessary to do so. So why not just outsource it? This is where our partner Vanta comes in. Vanta automates 90% of the security compliance work for you, getting you audit ready in weeks instead of months, saving you significant time and costs. As a special offer, Making Money listeners can get $1,000 off Vanta by going to vanta.com/makingmoney. There's also a link in the description for you. How much money do you think the tax of 22,000 at 1% would raise? Do you know that figure?
It raises you somewhere between 3 and 5 billion
a year.
Yeah.
How would you get to 200 billion off 3 to 5?
So
5 years.
You do a couple of things. You put together a lot of the state assets that we already own. So things like the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate owns things like the riverbeds and the seabeds out to the 12-mile limit. Very valuable now that we're building wind farms on them. There's a lot of other assets that the government has got. You could probably get about 60 to 80 billion quid's worth of assets put together. You would then, I think, do 3 or 4 different kind of taxes. So a one-off wealth tax, equalising capital gains tax and income tax, like Nigel Lawson.
Yeah.
Ask people to pay national insurance contributions on investment income, which they don't do at the moment. Close a few of the loopholes in inheritance tax. Altogether, that raises you somewhere between about 15 and 20 billion a year. If you then add that to the state assets that we can already put together, and you deliver a return of about 6 to 8% a year, which is the average return of a sovereign wealth fund, by the time you're getting to year 5, you're getting, I think it's about 180 billion you're kind of getting to. So the point is you can see a pathway to this. It's not impossible. It's not magic. And the question is, well, look, if that's not the answer, well, then what is?
Yeah, I've always, I've advocated for deposits into junior SIPs at birth for kids to, benefit from compounding. Similar kind of thing. It's like a sovereign wealth.
Benefit from compounding.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. And then you remove the pressure maybe to save as much for pensions, and then people can use that money for other things because we're leveraging time, right? And I look at like what we did with North Sea Oil, and we reduced taxes, and then is it Norway that just have now the biggest sovereign wealth fund on the planet?
If we hadn't just pissed away the proceeds of North Sea Oil, we would have a sovereign wealth fund worth £500 billion today.
Yeah.
When you say close loopholes in inheritance tax, are you talking about for the super wealthy who are finding ways around it? Because I know the average person does not like
hated tax.
Indeed. No one likes inheritance tax.
And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, if you put your fortunes into farmland, and you transfer your farmland to your children, or indeed in business investments,
the gravestone estate.
You could, for example, you can avoid a lot of those taxes. You can put the money into an offshore pension pot and avoid inheritance taxes. And so, do you remember the big debate about whether the king would pay inheritance tax when the late Queen died? The irony is that if the king had decided to pay inheritance tax, he would be the exception, not the rule, because the payment of inheritance tax collapses after about 2 million. Yeah. And so if you can afford the best lawyers and best financial advisors, it's free.
So it's really unfair. Yeah, it's unfair. My friend's mum passed away and he got left the house, but then he can't afford to pay the inheritance tax, so he had to sell the house and move out. So whereas if he was a multimillionaire, he'd find ways around it. Yeah. So it feels like it hits the average person more than...
And this is part of an argument about what I call restoring fairness to the tax system. So not a lot of people have read Rishi Sunak's tax return. It doesn't take long because he only publishes a page of it, which is the summary. But, Mr. Sunak's a successful guy. He earned 2 million quid last year, or in the last tax year that he declared. Rate of tax he paid on that? 23%.
I pay more tax than that.
I bet you both pay more tax than that.
Crazy.
And so my point is, well, look, how can that be right? And if that radical old socialist Nigel Lawson had equal rates of tax on capital gains and income, is it so left-wing to propose we go back to that?
Not at all.
What do you think of people then that say it doesn't matter how rich people get because we should incentivize people to get rich? What we should instead do is just focus on everyone having a basic level of, income and protection as such. So rather than going, no, you're too rich now.
So look, I mean, there is a book knocking around at the moment which is quite intriguing called Limitarianism, which says that there should be an upper ceiling on how rich people can be, and I don't believe in that because I do think you should have the lure of super returns to encourage people to innovate. This was an argument Joseph Schumpeter made in the 1930s.
Outliers deliver the returns, right? And you need a Jeff
you need
Bezos
superstar firms
to go at it.
And to disrupt things. But equally, I also believe that those with the broadest shoulders should carry the biggest burden. And, I had this discussion actually with Rishi Sunak at Christmas at the liaison committee. And I said, so, do you think it's fair that you should be paying 23% tax? And he kind of said, well, it's the regime that Gordon Brown introduced. And the questioning then moved on. Yeah, and so I didn't get the chance to say, I know, but that was before you put £1 trillion worth of quantitative easing into the monetary system. So some things have changed since 2010. So I think that this is an argument that people are up for, and I think there is political support for asking those who have done really well because of low interest rates over the last 10 years to pay a little bit more.
But you set out in your book that wealth makes people change on a chemical level.
It does.
That essentially,
I was surprised about that.
They change as humans.
Yeah.
The poorest people in society are the most generous, and so it's almost like you can't expect the rich to come round to this because
to go willingly.
It's almost evolutionary. You tell. I mean, you explain.
No, I mean, so this is research that's come from University of Berkeley in California, and I was so gobsmacked when I read it that I spent a bit of time talking to some of the academics who had researched it. But basically, the research shows that those who have become really successful, the brain chemistry does change a little bit, and it encourages more selfish rather than altruistic behavior. And people play the favorite way to test this is called the loaded Monopoly game. So people set up a game of Monopoly and they basically skew the rules so that some people are able to really do well by kind of cheating. And what they observe is that their behavior begins to change.
They get bigger.
They get bigger, they expand, they sort of,
right.
sort of
Puff up their chest.
steal all the twirl bites. It's really quite interesting. And that's why things like patriotic millionaires are sort of so interesting, because this is a lobby group of people who are very, very successful and who are leading the argument that those who have done really well should pay a bit more tax. So politically, this is obviously going to be really difficult. But again, I come back to the point, and this is the point I make to very successful people. Look, if we don't fix wealth inequality now, what the hell do you think is going to happen to the country that you're trading in over the next 10 to 15 years? It is going to become angrier, harder to govern, and that is going to be bad for business. So even out of your own kind of self-interest, if you want to be trading in this country in a harmonious society where people get on with each other and buy the stuff you're making, then we've got to fix this problem.
You discussed this sovereign fund or Commonwealth fund.
Yeah.
Who would run it in your idea?
So so government have to set it up, and Labour is legislating for a national wealth fund, which is currently too small in my view, and they haven't said anything about where the dividends would go. So I think it should be an independent fund. It should be something that is obviously under some kind of Treasury guidance because it's on our books. It will be a public asset, so we've got to account for it. But it should be independent of government, and it should be set up with the aim of paying dividends out to young people probably in a match for their savings or as a tax break. There was an argument that a friend of mine, David Willits, who was a Conservative, made a few years ago, which is that you would give the money as cash to people. I did some polling on that, and it proved quite unpopular. But if you give that money to people as a as a match for their savings or as a tax break, it goes from very unpopular to very popular. So I think we've got to be smart about how we get the public support for this, not least because we want this to be something sustainable over a long, long period of time. I mean, this should be something that becomes part of the constitution.
Something to be proud of, like an NHS or like
Like
part
an
of
NHS.
national identity
Exactly.
thing. Because I think
That's exactly right.
in Norway there was a populist movement that emerged where they basically said we've got like £1 trillion here. Let's
spend it.
Yeah. And the way they tackled that was instead of saying it was a wealth fund, they said it was the nation's pension. And then people were like, oh no, you don't blow the pension. You can't do that, because they were like, look, we could build all these bridges and trains. And so they had to create national pride behind the movement.
That's exactly right. And I said there was a similar example in Sweden where the Swedes did end up actually dissolving it, I think in the 1980s. So you have genuinely got to make it independent. It's definitely got to be, like, as you say, that's a really good phrase, like the NHS. It's got to be something that's there for the long term, for the future. And it's got to be one of the ways in which we help the younger generation get on. And this is, I notice this a lot now talking to pensioners. They do know that their grandkids are in a real bind, and they do want to try and do something to help them, but they're just not quite sure how.
How would you go about giving it to young people? Like, how do you define young
We're
people?
young.
Yeah, I know.
You're young.
I'm still a spring chicken.
You're both 24, right?
Yeah, I'm 24 for this purpose. Yeah,
But on that point, we graduated uni in the financial crisis. We've seen nothing but like collapses. I mean, I think people look at us now and go, "Oh, well, you're okay," but we're not. People in our age group are definitely not well off. And they don't own homes. And I think people say young, and you have a risk of cutting out a whole generation of millennials that then get to retirement and are scuppered.
Yeah. So this is a pickle, right? So the argument in the book, argument for discussion, is let's start with 25-year-olds, but that would have to be a national debate. You'd have to say, right, we're setting this thing up for the first time. Who should be in the first cohort? The second thing, though, that we have to do is we do have to make sure that everyone's got a bank account. So there are a quarter of people in our country who have net savings of less than £100. Right, that is a lot of people with very little. So some people have said, look, let's have a universal basic income. Let's just give 10 to 11 grand to everybody every year. And I looked at this and it's just not affordable. So that's what took me to this idea of universal basic capital. There is a system that has just been tested, which basically opens automatically for you, a bit like your auto-enrollment pension. It auto-enrolls you into a bank account. And it takes, £3 off a month. And they've run this for 4 years now. And it's proved phenomenally successful. So over 4 years, people keep their bank accounts open. Something like 95% of them keep their bank accounts open. They have built savings up of over £300 to £400. That is what I suggest is the foundation on which we build. We then have to do the third thing, which is to look at all of the different tax breaks for savings. Because at the moment, they benefit those who have got a lot, and they don't help those who have nothing. So there's about 2 billion quid's worth of tax incentives for ISAs, for example. Most of that money goes to people with over £100,000. If you've got very little and you're trying to get a savings match on something that you're squirreling away, there's almost no reward for you at the moment. So if you've got universal bank accounts, a dividend coming from a national wealth fund, and you've got a progressive tax system, I'm not saying that's a magic bullet, it's not going to solve everything, but at least you've got a system on which the country can begin building the wealth of those who have nothing.
So there's 1.8 trillion pounds in the UK sat in cash savings, which is just rotting, and 300 billion is in cash ISAs. And if you look at the distribution of cash ISAs, or people who only use cash ISAs, it's predominantly the poorest. Yeah. So they basically don't know they've got a personal savings allowance. Yeah. They take their money and they bang it in a cash ISA. Yeah. Don't you think that a better thing would be to educate people on the power of the stock market and get them to take cash savings and move them into the equities portion?
I do. And I think if we had a system where, I don't know, say at the age of 18 or when somebody started work, if they didn't have a bank account, one was open for them automatically, that would be the trigger for a revolution in financial education at school. It should be part of your PGCE studies.
Even bigger than that. It's life. It's, we spend 80% of our day working to get money, and then most people have no idea what to do with it, and they just blow it all.
Well, we don't have any financial education at school.
Yeah.
It should be like maths and English are compulsory up to GCSE.
I think
then you have like
it is on certain curriculums, but only 47% of kids actually receive the education, and most of them don't remember receiving it. And if
you know these figures better than me.
Yeah. They do just my job. If you survey teachers as well, they basically say, I don't feel comfortable teaching it because no one's ever taught me. Your history teachers learnt the curriculum. They're kind of like, I don't really get this.
That is really interesting. I did do a couple of surveys of teachers about the future of work a few years ago, and one of the questions was, what do you think is missing from the curriculum that we ought to be teaching kids about? And actually financial literacy topped the
there is resources. Martin Lewis created a resource, but even he was told you've got to pay for it, which is a joke, right? This guy's like, I'll put something in, and the government like, you pay for it though. We can agree that education needs to improve. I do also think that stuff can fall on deaf ears. You tell a kid at 14, say for your retirement, they'll be like, I'm going to live forever, so I don't need to think about that. But let's get back to the.
But peer effects are important, right? And so I think if you've got a bank account that as a young person, there is going to be either you open your own bank account or a bank account is going to be open for you. This is coming. There is going to be state aid available to help you save if you do the right thing. And you've then coupled that with a program of education. I think in a funny way, there are peer effects that we can harness now that weren't necessarily available, when I was at school. There are some good things that you can use social media for, and I think this is potentially 100%. One of them.
I mean, there's plenty of good. I mean, 1 million people a month watch my content, so there's a lot of influence there. And I think also as well, the message is getting through to younger generations that it's on them. I think older generations could kind of accidentally stumble into a relatively good retirement through defined benefit pensions and things. That's not available. And I do think that millennials and Gen Zs and younger, they are more actively engaged in finance. The problem is they end up sometimes stumbling across bad influences. But I think the media focuses too much on the bad and not on the good. 100%. They make every influencer out like they're shilling crypto when they're not. It's not the case.
That's their job, though. It's all sensationalism.
So then I speak to politicians and they're like, oh, so what is this TikTok? And are you talking about crypto? And it's like we still haven't brought them up to speed with the fact. No, it's just modern media, right? And it's good, and people are learning and they're seeking out this information. And they're empowering themselves. But anyway.
The point about empowering themselves is really important, though, because, if you want to safeguard someone's power, you've got to give them security. And there isn't any security without wealth.
No. So why, then, were there no wealth taxes from Rachel Reeves?
Well, we shall see in the budget.
You know something we don't.
I don't. But what I do know is that me and many others will be making that argument hard ahead of the budget. I mean, because look, if we're all in it together, then we all need to be in it together, right? And there are some people, as I say, who have done supremely well over the last 10 to 15 years because of £1 trillion worth of quantitative easing. And there is a very strong case that there ought to be a windfall tax on those fortunes. And if you do it in the right way, this is not money into the black hole of public spending. This could be money investing into the next generation.
Political appetite for tax on corporations exists because, we have windfall tax on energy companies. But then when it's individuals, people there's always a debate about, is that the right thing to do? But
it goes back to something you said earlier, which is, we worry about damaging the incentives to work hard and succeed. And we should be worried about those things. So you have got to get the balance right. But at the same time, we've got to recognise that there has just been a mother of all windfalls for a very lucky small number of people. And now, in difficult times, we need to ask them to put their hand in the pocket.
Can I flip this on the head of someone? So I pay a lot of tax. I not as much as these people, but I know that the rich
not as little as Rishi Sunak.
Exactly.
Yeah, but he would probably still say 20% of 2 million is a lot of money. And, to the people out there that pay low marginal tax rates but pay millions in tax, they might go, this country is falling apart. Why should I put more into the system when nothing works? The public services are crumbling. What would you say to those people?
How do you think we're going to get out of this hole?
I mean,
there isn't a magic wand in this life,
Yeah.
and if we are going to fix this country and it is broken, it's not free. We're going to need to do things differently. We're going to have to be more efficient. We're going to have to be more productive, but it is going to take more investment too. The reason that our country is in a cyclical and structural decline right now is not least because we have such low levels of investment. And, this is something that the Tories have made a mantra of. They've had a demand side strategy since 2010, cut taxes and the investment will bounce back. And guess what? The investment has never bounced back. And the
tax
argument,
rate's highest it's ever been.
the tax burden is the highest that it's ever been, not least because we're having to pay such very high levels of debt interest, well over 100 billion. But we have got to raise the public investment rate. It's one of the lowest in the G7. We've got to start investing in the kind of capital that makes the country more efficient. That's true in the NHS, it's true in the railways, it's true in technology. And if you do it in the right way, public investment can crowd in private investment.
Can we talk about the waste point then? Because if we use HS2 as an example, this would be a big infrastructure project that promises, all of the things that you talk about, but actually it was just a massive waste of money, wasn't it, in the end? Even if it was a good idea or a bad idea, let's leave that. Let's stand by the fact that we spent billions and did nothing.
We spent far too much. So I was the chief secretary that signed off High Speed 2 back in 2009 with Andrew Adonis, and then it was at about 30 billion, and it's now
100 billion was an
awful lot more.
Yeah.
And High Speed 2 kind of goes under my constituency. I'm a big supporter of High Speed 2 because it's going to revolutionise the wealth and welfare of East Birmingham. But when you go down in these tunnels, you really understand why it's so expensive. I mean, they basically decided to build the biggest underground system in the world. I mean, I think you're outside in fresh air on High Speed 2 for about 15, 16 minutes. The rest of it is in a tunnel. And the way they're building these tunnels is like they're kind of purifying the earth that kind of comes out of it. These are platinum-plated environmental standards, and perhaps that's a good thing. But did we need to put a tunnel under the Chilterns? There was some big kind of political decisions that were taken that radically increased the cost. And I just don't understand how the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time just sort of said, "Oh no, just spend what you like." They didn't kind of say
rates.
they didn't kind of say, no, this is the cap and you can't spend more than that. You need to tell us how to build a railway for this much money, not just wave on whatever new spending request came in. They just kind of lost control of it.
Because, as a citizen of the world, you go to other places and you go somewhere like China and you see them build a bridge in a week, basically.
It's mad, isn't it?
And then you come to England and it's like, we've been debating this bloody railway for a decade and no one's done anything.
Or
like,
Silverside Crossing.
What is going on?
Germany have got their trains running efficiently, to the
Italy.
second. Like Italy
Italy's
as
the
well.
same.
Motorways, trains, all of them on point. So
why are we so incapable of delivering these infrastructure projects?
So we are... so the benign answer to this is that we love property rights. And the challenge, therefore, is that we've then created this slightly bonkers planning system that means that you've got to debate people's property rights ad nauseum. And so the planning system is just sort of so crazy. I mean, there was one, I think it's the Thames crossing that they're proposing. It's just like thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of planning applications that have to be gone through. And the only people who make real money out of that are the lawyers. Mm-hmm. I'm not anti-lawyer, but I'm just saying. Keir
Starmer wasn't he?
Keir Starmer was a lawyer.
Yeah.
Human rights lawyer, admittedly. Not planning one.
No, I mean, they've said they want to simplify planning, don't they?
Yeah, and there is an act of parliament that's going to come to help us do that.
Do you think we can simplify these systems that are just so convoluted and complex?
I don't think
planning, tax.
We haven't got a choice. I mean, the money is so tight right now. If we don't sort this out, if we don't simplify this, we're going to be having this kind of conversation in 10 years' time. And we just haven't got that time to waste.
Like the UK tax legislation is something like 10 times bigger than the complete history of the complete works of Shakespeare.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the Hong Kong one is 257 pages, whereas ours is 10,000.
Yeah.
And like, who is ripping that book up?
Yeah.
Where are we going to start?
So there was a good idea that George Osborne had, which was the Office of Tax Simplification. And I don't quite know why it just didn't deliver. But it didn't.
They found out it was too complicated.
I think the tax system is now more complicated than it was in 2010. And one of the reasons for that is that obviously people keep adding exemptions and sort of different schemes to do this and that. And you have to keep plugging the new loopholes that emerge as clever people find ways around the rules. But you're right. I mean, the tax system has got to be simpler. And, look, what are we trying to do here? We are trying to create We want Britain to be one of the best places to invest. We want Britain to be one of the best places to be an innovator, an entrepreneur, an inventor. But we've got to kind of couple that, frankly, with a strategy to get us out the hole we're in at the moment, and crucially, make sure that we're building wealth for the next generation.
Yeah. Let's see, because I'm an innovator, I'm an entrepreneur. I employ 12 people. I run a media group of companies from my spare bedroom that gets millions of views a month.
Yeah.
But I have poor internet and I can't get to London quickly. So it feels that Openreach have said that we'll get internet by 2026. Oh, what is that? So, I mean, I went to a log cabin in Iceland on a glacier and I had faster internet than I do in Southport. So I approach this with a big dollop of skepticism, because I think from the north we get promised a lot of things that never happen.
And the truth is that if you kind of said to leaders in the north, right, this is what your budget is, you now decide how you're going to spend it, you would get problems like that fixed.
Andy Byrne fought for a decade just to get the buses.
Yeah. And how many times did he have to go to court? How much did the lawyers cost?
And instantly better.
Just to run a bus network.
Yeah.
Mad.
It is mad. Well, I'm glad you agree, because it feels like sometimes...
This is experience that is born of being a cabinet minister. So, if there's one thing that being a cabinet minister teaches you, it is that departments always defend their turf. They really are not keen on collaborating with others. And they tend to think that they know best.
But it's mad when the public have voted you, I say you as your party, into power, that you then don't have the power. It's like they say you run the country, and then you're like, oh, we can't run the country because these guys actually run it.
No, I think where we need to be is actually giving that power away. We need to be devolving power. I think Andy Burnham and Richard Parker in the West Midlands can make better decisions about their regions than civil servants can in Westminster and Whitehall. And crucially, they can put different budgets together in a way that is much, much harder to do in Westminster and Whitehall. So, my final point on this, I'm mildly obsessed about this. If you think about the world that we live in today, right, it's quite complicated. Conflict in Russia, rise of China, need to rearm, quite big decisions, climate crisis. We need Westminster and Whitehall focused on tackling global issues, and that means that they haven't got the bandwidth to worry about the unit cost of apprenticeships in Southport. Frankly, they need to just figure out what they need to focus on and devolve power and resource over everything else to people who are on the front line.
Seems common sense, doesn't it?
I like to think so.
My uncle was in the army, and he was quite senior, and he was all about logistics. So he would set up, like a Camp Bastion kind of, or whatever. So big projects, multi-billions. And I said to him, would you control it all centrally? He's like, it's mental. You couldn't do it. You couldn't run a project. You couldn't tell the truck driver where to park. You just got to trust that they can make a good decision in a day. And it's like the country is far more complicated than those projects, and we're running it from a central location.
You think about the economy of Manchester and the Northwest, it's bigger than some European countries. Why would you try and run it?
You're very passionate about this. Do you feel that the Labour Party kind of shares your sentiment? Like, what percentage of people are obviously they should all read your book.
They definitely should all read it.
Yeah, definitely. But do you feel like a lot of people are on your side, or it's an uphill battle?
I do. It's a great question. And I do. And what is really interesting at the moment is this amazing new intake of Labour MPs that has come in. I've been around a long time, and this is by far and away the smartest, most motivated, most disciplined group of new MPs I have.
Torsten Bell, people like that. Is that who you mean?
Bell, but you could name hundreds of names. And
is that because there's power on the table now? Maybe
it's because there's power on the table. I think also you've just had a lot of people who have said, right, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to roll my sleeves and get stuck in. So, and these guys are going to change the world, basically. And the sooner we hand power over to them in a way,
it feels like that. But I'm optimistic, so I'm not sure if everyone feels the same as me. But it does feel like we're kind of having a change a little bit.
In my business, you have to be optimistic, otherwise you quite quickly become depressed.
Makes sense.
Are you optimistic?
I am.
Of the future of the UK?
So I got asked this question the other day, and actually I paused for thought, because the truth is I'm really anxious. I'm determined, but I am anxious because I'm now far more worried about what is at stake. I genuinely think if we do not fix this now, we are going to be in a terrible, terrible place over the next 10 years. So I do think this is a big moment in our country's history, and I think there's a big choice on the table.
Sometimes these conversations that focus on the big issues can be really scary, but I still think that individuals can empower themselves. So what we've done off the back of this is put together a 2-pager that you can sign up to that gives you 80% of everything you need to know about personal finance in one little document. So go get that below in the description.